We do not seat people like you here." The words cut through the quiet glow of the dining room like a knife across glass. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A wine glass hovered halfway to someone's lips. At the entrance of Sterling Table, one of the most expensive restaurants in downtown Chicago, a tall black man stood calmly beneath the chandelier light while a young waiter blocked his path with a rigid arm across the host stand. Outside the tall windows, the city glowed with evening traffic and yellow taxi lights. But inside the restaurant, the air felt suddenly tight, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The man did not raise his voice. He did not argue. His dark wool coat was worn but clean, his shoes dusty from walking several blocks through the cold March wind, and his hands rested loosely at his sides as he looked at the waiter with quiet patience. The waiter, Ethan Collins, barely 25 years old and proud of working in a restaurant where the cheapest steak cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week, leaned slightly forward with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. A few nearby diners glanced over their shoulders, curious but pretending not to stare. Somewhere deeper in the restaurant, a fork clinked softly against porcelain. Then the sound stopped. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The man at the door was named Marcus Reed, and he had walked nearly half a mile through the evening chill after stepping off a city bus 3 blocks away. The wind coming off Lake Michigan had carried the smell of snow, even though the calendar insisted it was already spring, and by the time he reached the tall glass doors of Sterling Table, his hands had grown stiff from the cold. Still, when he pushed the door open, he had stepped inside with the same calm confidence he carried everywhere, the kind that came from a life spent learning that dignity did not depend on anyone else's permission. The restaurant was exactly the kind of place most people only saw in magazines. Crystal chandeliers glowed above white linen tables. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. A wall of glass displayed bottles of wine that cost more than a used pickup truck. Couples in tailored suits and silk dresses leaned close over candlelight while a pianist in the corner played slow, elegant chords. Marcus had paused for a moment just inside the doorway, taking in the warm light after the cold street outside, and for a brief second he had allowed himself a quiet smile. He had not come here to prove anything. He had not come to make a scene. He had come for dinner. But the moment Ethan Collins looked up from the host stand and saw him standing there, something subtle shifted in the young waiter's expression. It was a small change, barely noticeable to anyone who was not watching closely, yet Marcus noticed it immediately. The polite hospitality that greeted the wealthy guests before him disappeared as if someone had flipped a switch. Ethan straightened his vest, glanced quickly at Marcus from head to toe, and then leaned one elbow on the polished wood counter as though guarding a private club. "Reservations only tonight," he said flatly, even though 3 empty tables sat clearly visible near the windows overlooking the city lights. Marcus glanced briefly toward those tables, then back at the waiter. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I only need 1 seat," he said. "Dinner will be quick." Ethan gave a short laugh under his breath and tapped the reservation book with the tip of his pen as if the conversation had already ended. Behind Marcus, the cold wind slipped through the doorway again before the glass door closed with a quiet click, sealing the warm room and all its silent judgment around them. The young waiter did not move his arm from the host's stand, and the quiet tension that had begun to form around the entrance slowly spread through the elegant room like a ripple across still water. Ethan Collins flipped open the reservation book and pretended to scan the neat lines of names written across the page, though he had already decided that the man standing in front of him would not be added to that list tonight. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he was, calm and steady, the soft restaurant light reflecting off the polished marble floor beneath his shoes. A couple seated near the entrance leaned slightly toward each other and whispered behind their menus, their eyes drifting back toward the doorway again and again. From the bar area, a bartender paused while polishing a glass, watching the scene with a quiet curiosity that he quickly tried to hide. Marcus glanced once more toward the empty tables near the windows where the city lights of Chicago shimmered against the dark lake beyond, and then he returned his gaze to the young waiter with the same composed patience he had carried since the moment he stepped inside. Ethan tapped the reservation book again with the tip of his pen, as if that small motion confirmed his authority over the doorway. Like I said, he repeated, his voice low but firm, "We are fully booked tonight." Marcus tilted his head slightly and allowed his eyes to move briefly across the dining room, taking in the 3 open tables that had not yet been cleared for the evening crowd. One of them sat directly beside the tall glass wall, overlooking the street, where a stream of headlights slid past like slow-moving stars. He pointed toward that table with a gentle motion of his hand. "That seat looks open," Marcus said quietly. Ethan followed the direction of a gesture, but shrugged with a dismissive smile. "Those are reserved," he replied. "Private guests." A faint murmur rose from a nearby table, where 2 businessmen had begun listening more openly now, their conversation forgotten as the moment stretched longer than anyone expected. Marcus drew in a slow breath, the warmth of the restaurant slowly returning feeling to his fingers after the long walk through the wind outside. He was used to moments like this. Years earlier they might have stung more sharply, but time had taught him that anger only gave strangers power they did not deserve. Instead, he rested one hand lightly against the polished wood of the host's stand and spoke in the same calm tone. "If there is space later this evening, I will wait," he said. Ethan let out a short laugh that carried farther than he intended, and the sound caused several diners to glance over again. "Sir," the waiter said with growing impatience, "this place has a certain atmosphere. People plan weeks ahead to eat here." His eyes moved again across Marcus from coat to shoes, lingering a second longer than necessary, as if measuring something only he could see. "You should probably try somewhere more casual down the street." The words hung in the air, like a quiet challenge. Marcus did not respond right away. Instead, he looked past the young waiter for a moment, studying the interior of the restaurant with a thoughtful expression. The room was beautiful in a careful, deliberate way. White linen tables were arranged with perfect symmetry. Candles flickered in small glass holders. The soft music from the piano drifted through the space like warm smoke. It reminded Marcus of another dining room from long ago, though that memory sat quietly in the back of his mind for now. When he finally looked back at Ethan, there was no anger in his eyes, only a steady curiosity. "You are certain there is no table?" Marcus asked gently. Ethan closed the reservation book with a soft snap and folded his arms. "Absolutely certain." For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence became so complete that the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen suddenly seemed much louder than before. A young busboy carrying a tray of water glasses slowed his steps as he passed behind Marcus, glancing briefly at the scene before continuing toward the dining room. Near the bar, the bartender set down the glass he had been polishing and leaned forward slightly, pretending to adjust a bottle while keeping the doorway in view. Marcus finally nodded once, accepting the answer without argument. But instead of turning toward the door, he remained standing there, quietly observing the restaurant as if studying something deeper than the menu or the empty tables. And somewhere beyond the dining room walls, hidden behind the swinging doors of the kitchen, a small shift in the rhythm of the evening had already begun to take shape. The quiet tension near the entrance lingered like a thin layer of smoke, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Marcus Reed remained standing beside the host stand, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady as he looked across the dining room once more. The candles on the tables flickered softly, reflecting in the polished glasses and silverware arranged with careful precision. Around him, the restaurant slowly resumed its rhythm, though not completely. Conversations restarted in low voices, but every few seconds another pair of eyes drifted toward the doorway. Ethan Collins noticed it too. He shifted his weight and straightened the front of his vest, tried to reclaim the authority he believed came with the small podium and the leather reservation book, resting beneath his hand. "Sir," Ethan said again, this time with a sharper edge, "if you are not leaving, you are blocking the entrance." Marcus turned his head slightly toward the door behind him and stepped half a pace to the side so incoming guests could pass through without obstruction. A well-dressed couple entered from the cold street outside, their coats dusted with tiny drops of melting snow. Ethan greeted them immediately with a wide professional smile that had been completely absent only moments earlier. "Good evening. Welcome to Sterling Table," he said warmly. The couple gave their reservation name, and within seconds Ethan was leading them past the empty tables Marcus had noticed earlier. The man of the couple glanced briefly back toward Marcus as they walked deeper into the restaurant, curiosity flickering across his face before disappearing behind polite indifference. When Ethan returned to the host stand, he found Marcus still standing there, calm and patient as before. The waiter let out a slow breath through his nose. "You really should try somewhere else," he muttered. "There's a steakhouse 2 blocks south that does not require reservations." Marcus considered the suggestion for a moment, but did not move. Instead, he looked toward the open kitchen doorway at the far end of the dining room, where a warm glow spilled into the hallway each time the swinging door opened. Inside that kitchen, dozens of small sounds blended together in a steady rhythm. The sharp hiss of a pan touching heat. The quick tap of knives against cutting boards. The low voices of cooks calling out orders. A young busboy who had passed earlier returned, now carrying an empty tray. His name tag read Luis Hernandez. As he walked behind Marcus, he slowed slightly, glancing from the tall, quiet guest to the tense young waiter. Luis had worked at Sterling Table for nearly 2 years, and he understood the delicate balance of the dining room better than most. Something about this moment felt wrong. Not loud or dramatic, but wrong in a quieter way that settled uncomfortably in his chest. When Luis stepped through the kitchen doors, he set the tray down beside the dish station and leaned toward one of the line cooks. "There's a man at the front who has been waiting," he whispered. The cook barely looked up from the row of steaks sizzling across the grill. "Tell Ethan to seat him," the cook said without thinking. Luis hesitated before answering. "Ethan says there are no tables." The cook finally lifted his eyes and frowned. "There are always tables early in the evening," he said. Another cook glanced toward the dining room doors, curiosity stirring among the kitchen staff like a small ripple spreading through water. Sterling Table was known throughout Chicago for its strict standards and flawless service. Guests were not kept standing at the entrance unless something unusual was happening. Luis wiped his hands on a towel and walked a few steps deeper into the kitchen where the air smelled of butter, garlic, and seared meat. At the center of the room stood the man who controlled the entire operation, Chef Daniel Laurent. Tall, focused, and precise in every movement. He worked over a cutting board arranging thin slices of roasted duck with careful attention. His white jacket was spotless despite the rush of the evening, and the cooks around him moved with the quiet discipline of people who respected his skill. Luis cleared his throat softly. "Chef," he said, trying not to interrupt the rhythm of the kitchen. Daniel Laurent glanced up for only a moment. "What is it, Luis?" The busboy shifted slightly on his feet. "There's a guest at the front door. He has been standing there for a while." Chef Laurent returned his attention to the plate in front of him. "Then Ethan should seat him," he replied calmly. Luis hesitated again, his voice dropping lower. "Ethan says the guest does not belong here." The knife in Daniel Laurent's hand stopped moving for the first time that evening. The kitchen continued its steady rhythm around him, but for a brief second the chef did not speak. Something in the quiet certainty of the busboy's words had caught his attention in a way the evening orders had not. Slowly he set the knife down beside the cutting board and lifted his head toward the dining room doors, as if listening to a distant sound no one else had noticed yet. Chef Daniel Laurent did not speak for several seconds after Luis finished explaining. The noise of the kitchen continued around him like a steady current, pans sizzling, plates sliding across stainless steel counters, cooks calling out times and temperatures, but the chef remained still with his eyes fixed on the swinging doors that separated the kitchen from the dining room. Slowly he wiped his hands on a folded towel and glanced toward the clock mounted above the pass. It was early evening, the hour when Sterling Table usually began filling with its most loyal guests. There was no reason anyone should be standing at the entrance for more than a moment. Daniel Laurent had built his reputation on discipline, precision, and respect for the people who walked through those doors. A guest left waiting without explanation was not just poor service. It was a failure of the entire restaurant. He picked up the towel again and set it aside with deliberate care before turning toward Luis. "How long has he been standing there?" the chef asked quietly. Luis shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Several minutes, chef. Maybe longer." One of the line cooks nearby paused while plating a dish and looked over his shoulder. "Is there a problem out front?" he asked. Luis glanced briefly at the other cooks before answering. Ethan told him there were no tables. The cook frowned. "But there are empty tables." Chef Laurent heard that last sentence clearly. He lifted his eyes toward the dining room doors again, the faint sound of piano music drifting through each time the doors opened. "Did the guest have a reservation?" the chef asked. Luis shook his head slowly. "I do not think so." Daniel Laurent exhaled once through his nose, calm but thoughtful. In his years running kitchens across the United States, he had learned that mistakes in the dining room often started small. A misunderstanding, a rushed decision, a young employee protecting rules he did not fully understand. But something in the way Luis had described the moment felt different. The busboy had not said the guest was impatient or angry. He had said the guest did not belong. The phrase settled heavily in the chef's mind. Daniel Laurent had grown up in a small neighborhood outside New Orleans where his father had run a modest cafe with 6 tables and a coffee machine that rattled loudly each morning. In that cafe, every customer had been treated the same, whether they wore a business suit or work boots covered in dust from a construction site. His father used to say that a restaurant was not only about food. It was about dignity. Anyone who stepped through the door deserved a seat and a meal if they could pay for it. That lesson had followed Daniel Laurent through every kitchen he had ever worked in. Now he placed both hands on the stainless steel counter in front of him and looked toward Luis again. "What does the guest look like?" he asked. Luis hesitated only a moment. He is a tall black man, maybe in his late 40s. He has been very calm. He has not raised his voice. A few of the cooks exchanged brief glances, but returned quickly to their work. Chef Laurent nodded slowly, absorbing the description. Calm, waiting quietly. Those were not the signs of someone causing trouble. He reached for the small notebook he kept beside the pass and closed it carefully. "Finish the duck plate," he told the cook beside him. "Send it to table 12. The cook nodded and returned to his task. Then Daniel Laurent removed his apron and folded it neatly over the counter. The movement caught the attention of several members of the kitchen staff because it was unusual for the chef to leave the line during the busiest part of service. Luis watched with wide eyes as the chef straightened the front of his white jacket and walked toward the swinging doors. Before pushing them open, he paused for just a second, listening to the soft piano music and the murmur of conversation beyond the kitchen. Then he stepped through the doorway and into the dining room, his gaze immediately moving toward the entrance where Marcus Reed still stood beside the host stand, patient and silent under the warm chandelier light, while Ethan Collins remained planted in front of him with folded arms, completely unaware that the quiet moment he thought he controlled was about to change. Chef Daniel Laurent stepped fully into the dining room, and the subtle rhythm of the restaurant shifted almost immediately. The cooks in the kitchen continued their work behind the swinging doors, but several diners noticed the tall chef in the white jacket walking across the polished floor and quietly followed his movement with their eyes. It was unusual for the head chef of Sterling Table to leave the kitchen during dinner service, and the quiet authority in his stride carried a weight that even the soft piano music could not soften. At the entrance, Ethan Collins was still standing behind the host stand with his arms folded, while Marcus Reed remained patiently in front of him. The waiter noticed the approaching figure first and quickly straightened his posture, the confidence on his face returning as he assumed the chef was simply checking on the evening flow of guests. Marcus also turned slightly, sensing the presence moving toward them, though his expression remained calm and thoughtful. Daniel Laurent slowed as he reached the host stand, taking in the scene with careful attention. The empty tables near the windows were still visible. The candlelight glowed gently across the room. The quiet tension around the entrance had not completely disappeared. For a moment, the chef did not speak. He simply looked from the young waiter to the guest who had been waiting so patiently. Ethan cleared his throat and offered a polite smile that felt forced even to himself. "Good evening, chef," he said. Everything is under control here. Daniel Laurent nodded slightly, but did not remove his eyes from Marcus Reed. The two men studied one another in silence for a brief second that seemed longer than it truly was. Marcus saw a tall man with calm eyes and the quiet focus of someone used to leading a busy kitchen. Daniel Laurent saw a guest who had not argued, had not raised his voice, and had not left even after being told there was no table available. That alone was enough to make the chef curious. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice steady and respectful. "Good evening, sir. My name is Daniel Laurent. I am a chef here. I understand you have been waiting." Marcus gave a small nod. "Good evening." Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside them. "Chef, I already explained that we are fully booked tonight," he said quickly. "There are private reservations for the open tables." Daniel Laurent turned his head slightly toward the waiter, but did not respond to him immediately. Instead, he continued looking at Marcus Reed, as if measuring something deeper than the simple question of seating a guest. "Have you been helped yet?" the chef asked calmly. Marcus allowed a faint smile to touch his face, the kind of expression that carried patience rather than frustration. "Your waiter has been very clear," he replied quietly. The words were polite, but they carried a weight that made Ethan's shoulders tighten. Several nearby diners had begun watching openly now, sensing that the moment at the entrance had grown more serious than a simple reservation problem. The bartender leaned slightly forward from behind the counter, pretending to adjust a bottle while listening carefully. Daniel Laurent placed one hand on the polished surface of the host stand and glanced briefly at the reservation book resting beside Ethan's arm. "And there are truly no seats available?" he asked slowly. Ethan nodded with quick confidence. "That is correct, chef." The chef looked past him toward the dining room again, where the 3 empty tables still waited quietly beneath the chandelier light. One of them had not yet been cleared from the previous guests, but the other 2 stood ready with fresh glasses and folded napkins. Daniel Laurent returned his gaze to Marcus. "May I ask your name?" he said. Marcus Reed answered without hesitation. "Marcus Reed." For a fraction of a second, the chef's expression shifted in a way so subtle that most people in the room would not have noticed. His eyes focused more sharply, studying the man in front of him as if a memory had just brushed against the edge of his thoughts. The name seemed to echo quietly in his mind. "Marcus Reed." The chef repeated it silently to himself, while the piano continued playing softly in the background and the candle flames flickered against the glassware. Ethan Collins noticed the pause and quickly spoke again, trying to move the moment along before it grew more complicated. "Chef, if the gentleman would like, I can recommend another restaurant nearby." But Daniel Laurent was no longer listening to the waiter. He was looking directly at Marcus Reed now, the calm curiosity in his eyes slowly transforming into something deeper as the faint spark of recognition began to form. For a long, quiet moment, the name Marcus Reed seemed to echo somewhere deep inside Daniel Laurent's memory. The chef stood very still beside the host stand, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him, while the soft piano music continued drifting through the restaurant like a calm river of sound. Around them, the evening service carried on, waiters moving between tables, glasses clinking softly, low conversations rising and falling beneath the chandelier light. Yet the small circle of space near the entrance felt strangely separated from the rest of the room. Marcus Reed did not speak again. He simply watched the chef with the same steady calm he had shown since arriving. Ethan Collins shifted beside them with growing impatience. The young waiter felt the eyes of several guests turning toward the entrance, and he did not like the feeling. He cleared his throat again and forced another polite smile. "Chef, the gentleman does not have a reservation," Ethan said quietly but firmly, as if repeating the rule would settle the matter. "All available tables are already accounted for." Daniel Laurent did not respond immediately. Instead, he continued studying Marcus Reed's face, searching through memories that felt just beyond reach. The chef had met thousands of guests in restaurants across the United States. Most faces blended together after a few weeks, but sometimes a name carried a weight that refused to fade with time. Marcus Reed. The name stirred something older than this restaurant and older than the elegant dining room around them. A memory of a smaller kitchen many years ago. A younger version of himself standing beside a battered stove, while a stranger offered a quiet opportunity that changed the direction of his life. Daniel Laurent slowly drew in a breath. "You said your name is Marcus Reed," he repeated softly. Marcus nodded once. "That is correct." The chef studied him again. The man standing in front of him looked older now, his hair touched with a few threads of gray, his coat worn from years of use. Yet something in his eyes carried a familiar steadiness. Daniel Laurent felt the faint pull of recognition growing stronger. Ethan noticed the hesitation and quickly spoke again, his voice a little tighter this time. "Chef, if we allow walk-ins tonight, the other guests will complain." Marcus remained silent during the exchange. His hands rested calmly at his sides while he observed the restaurant with a quiet interest that seemed almost detached from the tension forming around him. After a moment, Daniel Laurent finally turned slightly toward Ethan. "How long has Mr. Reed been standing here?" the chef asked. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Only a few minutes." From the bar, the bartender quietly shook his head to himself because he had watched the man waiting much longer than that. Daniel Laurent returned his attention to Marcus. "Did you ask for a table?" he said. Marcus allowed a faint, thoughtful smile. "I asked if one might be available." The answer was simple, but it carried a tone of patience that made the young waiter uncomfortable. The chef glanced once more across the dining room, where the empty tables remained visible beneath the warm lights. The restaurant was busy, but not full. A trained eye could see that clearly. Then Daniel Laurent looked back at Marcus Reed again, and the memory that had been circling in his mind suddenly grew sharper. It was not only the name now. It was the calm voice. The same quiet dignity he remembered from years earlier, when he had been a struggling cook with more ambition than opportunity. The chef leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping lower, as if speaking through a moment of disbelief. "Have we met before?" he asked. Marcus considered the question for a second before answering. "It has been many years," he said gently. The word struck Daniel Laurent like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. His eyes widened just slightly as recognition began to rise fully to the surface. For the first time since stepping into the dining room, the chef looked completely past Ethan Collins and focused only on the man who had been waiting so patiently at the door. The quiet words Marcus Reed had just spoken seemed to settle over the entrance like a soft weight that no one could easily ignore. Daniel Laurent stood motionless for a moment, staring at the man before him while the memory in his mind sharpened into something undeniable. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant performance, plates moving from kitchen to table, glasses catching the warm chandelier light, yet the chef heard almost none of it now. His attention was fixed entirely on the man who had been standing patiently at the door. Ethan Collins shifted beside them, unaware of the history quietly unfolding between the two men. The waiter folded his arms again, trying to maintain control of the situation even though the silence around the entrance had grown heavy with curiosity. Several diners were openly watching now, their conversations fading as they sensed that something unusual was happening. Daniel Laurent slowly exhaled, the recognition in his eyes growing clearer with each passing second. The last time he had seen Marcus Reed, he had been a very different man. Younger, desperate to prove himself in a crowded world of chefs who guarded their kitchens like fortresses. Back then he had been working in a small restaurant on the south side of Chicago, a place where the ovens rattled and the dining room chairs never quite matched. He had talent, but no reputation, ambition, but no opportunity. One evening, after a long shift that had nearly broken his spirit, a quiet guest had sat alone at a corner table and ordered the simplest dish on the menu. That guest had been Marcus Reed. Daniel Laurent remembered the moment clearly now. The man had asked to meet the cook who prepared the meal. When Daniel stepped out from the kitchen, nervous and unsure, Marcus Reed had studied him with the same calm expression he wore tonight. Instead of criticism or polite compliments, Marcus had asked him a single question that Daniel never forgot. What would you do if someone finally gave you a real kitchen? The memory returned so vividly that Daniel Laurent almost felt the heat of that old stove again. Marcus had not been a celebrity chef or a wealthy restaurant owner. He had simply been a man who believed talent deserved a chance. Within a month, he had quietly connected Daniel with a culinary foundation that funded apprenticeships in some of the most respected kitchens in the country. That opportunity had opened doors Daniel never could have reached alone. Now, standing inside the elegant dining room of Sterling Table, the chef felt the weight of that past settle fully into place. He looked again at the man in front of him and saw not a stranger waiting for a table, but the person who had changed the direction of his entire life. Daniel Laurent straightened slightly, and his voice softened with a tone of respect that immediately caught the attention of everyone close enough to hear. "Mr. Reed," he said slowly, almost as if confirming the truth to himself. Marcus gave a small nod, the faint smile still resting on his face. "It seems you remember after all," he replied. The words carried no pride, no demand for recognition, only a gentle warmth that made the moment feel strangely personal despite the crowded room around them. Ethan Collins looked from one man to the other, confused by the sudden change in the chef's tone. The young waiter had expected Daniel Laurent to reinforce the rules of the restaurant, not speak. To the guest, as if greeting someone important. "Chef," Ethan said quietly, trying to regain the conversation, "I told him there are no available tables tonight." Daniel Laurent did not look at the waiter immediately. His eyes remained on Marcus Reed, the respect in his expression growing clearer with every second. Then, very slowly, the chef turned his head toward Ethan Collins, and the calm authority in his voice carried across the entrance in a way that made several nearby diners fall completely silent. The calm authority in Daniel Laurent's voice settled over the entrance like a sudden change in weather. When he finally turned fully toward Ethan Collins, the young waiter felt something shift in the air that he could not immediately explain. The chef did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. Yet the quiet firmness in his expression carried far more weight than any argument could have. Several diners near the doorway had already stopped pretending not to watch. Even the pianist in the corner allowed the last note of a chord to fade more slowly than usual, sensing the tension that had gathered near the entrance of the restaurant. Ethan cleared his throat and tried to maintain the professional tone he had used all evening. "Chef, as I explained, the gentleman does not have a reservation. All available tables are reserved for scheduled guests." Daniel Laurent looked at him for a moment, the way a teacher studies a student who has just answered a question incorrectly with complete confidence. Then the chef turned his gaze slowly toward the dining room. The empty tables near the windows were still there, their white linen cloths glowing softly beneath the chandelier light. One table had already been reset with fresh glasses and neatly folded napkins. Anyone with even a small understanding of restaurant service could see that the dining room still had space. When Daniel Laurent spoke again, his tone remained calm, but unmistakably firm. "Ethan," he said quietly, "how long have you worked here?" The question caught the waiter off guard. "Almost 2 years, chef." Daniel nodded once. "Then you should know that we do not leave guests standing at the door while empty tables are visible." Ethan felt heat rise slightly into his face, but he held his position. "I was protecting the reservation list," he replied quickly. Daniel Laurent did not argue. Instead, he turned back toward Marcus Reed, the respect in his posture now impossible to hide. The chef took one small step forward and lowered his head slightly in a gesture that stunned several nearby diners who recognized him as the strict and disciplined leader of the kitchen. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth now, "I owe much of my career to your kindness many years ago." A quiet ripple of surprise moved through the nearest tables. Ethan blinked in confusion, trying to process the meaning of the statement. Marcus Reed simply gave a modest smile, the same calm expression he had worn since entering the restaurant. "You built your career through your own work," Marcus replied gently. "I only pointed you toward a door." Daniel Laurent shook his head softly. "Without that door, I would never have found the path that brought me here." The chef then turned slightly toward the host's stand and gestured toward the dining room. "Please allow me to correct this situation." Ethan opened his mouth as if to speak again, but no words came out. The young waiter suddenly realized that the quiet man he had dismissed only minutes earlier was someone the chef clearly respected deeply. Around them the room had fallen into a curious silence. The bartender had stopped polishing glasses. The couple who had entered earlier now watched openly from their table. Even the busboy Luis stood near the kitchen doors, observing the moment with wide eyes. Daniel Laurent extended his arm toward the empty table beside the window overlooking the lights of Chicago. "Mr. Reed," he said with calm dignity, "your table is ready." For the first time since the evening began, Marcus Reed stepped forward from the entrance. His shoes moved softly across the marble floor while the candlelight reflected along the path toward the table. As he passed the host stand, he paused briefly and looked at Ethan Collins, not with anger, but with the same quiet patience that had defined the entire encounter. The young waiter could not meet his eyes for more than a second. Then Marcus continued toward the table while Daniel Laurent walked beside him, the chef personally guiding the guest through the dining room. Behind them, the restaurant slowly began to breathe again, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a moment of quiet rejection had turned into something far more powerful, and everyone in the room could feel that the evening at Sterling Table had just taken an unexpected turn. Marcus Reed moved quietly through the dining room beside Daniel Laurent, and the soft glow of candlelight reflected across the polished floor as guests followed the moment with silent curiosity. The table beside the tall glass window overlooked the moving lights of Chicago traffic, and beyond the buildings the dark surface of Lake Michigan stretched into the night like a calm sheet of black glass. Daniel Laurent reached the chair first and gently pulled it back. It was a small gesture, yet coming from the chef of Sterling Table, it carried a weight that no one in the room missed. Marcus paused for a brief second before sitting, his calm expression unchanged, as though the attention surrounding him did not belong to him at all. When he lowered himself into the chair, the room slowly resumed its quiet rhythm, though the energy had shifted in a way that could not easily be undone. Conversations restarted in careful voices. Glasses lifted again, yet many guests still glanced toward the window table, curious about the man who had just been escorted personally by the chef. Daniel Laurent remained standing beside Marcus for a moment longer. The chef folded his hands in front of him with a posture that carried both respect and quiet gratitude. "It has been many years since our last conversation," Daniel said. Marcus looked up at him with a gentle nod. "Time moves quickly when people are busy building their lives." The chef allowed a small smile. "You gave me a chance to build mine." For a moment, neither man spoke again. The quiet between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of silence shared by people who understood each other without needing many words. Across the room, Ethan Collins still stood near the host stand, his posture stiff as he watched the exchange from a distance. The young waiter had begun to realize that the situation he thought he controlled had quietly slipped far beyond his understanding. Luis the busboy stepped carefully toward the table, carrying a glass bottle of water and 2 crystal glasses. His movements were slower than usual because he did not want to interrupt the moment unfolding between the guest and the chef. He placed the glasses gently on the table and filled one before stepping back with respectful caution. Daniel Laurent finally reached for a menu resting on the edge of the table and opened it with practiced ease. "Please allow me to recommend something special this evening," he said. Marcus glanced briefly at the menu, but closed it again after only a few seconds. "I trust your kitchen completely," he replied. The chef nodded with appreciation. "Then I will prepare a tasting for you myself." A faint murmur of surprise traveled through a nearby table where 2 guests recognized the meaning of those words. When Daniel Laurent prepared a meal, personally, it was considered one of the highest honors in the restaurant. Marcus noticed their reaction and smiled faintly, but said nothing. The chef leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear the next words clearly. "When I left that small kitchen years ago, I promised myself that if I ever build a place like this, I would never forget who opened the first door for me." Marcus's expression softened with quiet humility. "You honored that promise simply by becoming the chef you are today." Daniel Laurent straightened again and nodded once before stepping away from the table. As he walked back toward the kitchen, the staff around the room moved with renewed focus, as though the evening had gained a new purpose. Behind him, Marcus Reed sat calmly beside the window, watching the city lights and the slow movement of people across the dining room floor. The tension from earlier had disappeared, replaced by a quiet respect that spread through Sterling Table like a warm current. Yet near the entrance, Ethan Collins remained frozen beside the host stand, the weight of what had just happened slowly settling into his mind while the rest of the restaurant continued moving forward without him. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere shifted the moment Daniel Laurent returned through the swinging doors. The cooks immediately sensed the change in his expression. The chef was not angry, but the quiet seriousness in his posture carried the kind of authority that made everyone on the line move with sharper focus. Pans continued to hiss across the burners while plates moved steadily toward the pass. Yet several members of the staff glanced up briefly as the chef stepped back into his position. Daniel washed his hands slowly at the small sink beside the counter, his thoughts still lingering on the moment at the entrance. For years he had imagined the possibility of seeing Marcus Reed again, yet he had never expected the meeting to happen in such a way. When he turned back toward the line, his voice carried calm clarity. "I will prepare the tasting personally," he said. One of the sous chefs nodded immediately and cleared space along the counter. The kitchen staff understood the meaning of the instruction. When Daniel Laurent cooked a meal himself, it meant that every detail mattered. Outside in the dining room, Marcus Reed sat quietly at the table beside the window. The city lights shimmered across the glass while cars moved along the street below in slow rivers of white and red. Luis returned once more, carrying a small basket of warm bread, and placed it carefully on the table. "If you need anything, please let me know," he said softly. Marcus thanked him with a gentle nod. Across the room, Ethan Collins remained at the host's stand, but the confidence he had shown earlier had completely disappeared. The young waiter watched the chef working through the kitchen doors and felt a tightening in his chest that he could not easily ignore. The words Daniel Laurent had spoken earlier continued repeating in his mind. "I owe much of my career to your kindness many years ago." Ethan glanced toward Marcus Reed again, this time seeing not the worn coat or the dusty shoes, but the calm dignity that had been there all along. For the first time since the evening began, he felt a quiet wave of regret begin to rise. A few minutes later, the kitchen doors opened again, and Daniel Laurent stepped out carrying the first plate himself. The entire dining room noticed. The chef walked directly to the window table and placed the dish gently in front of Marcus. It was a small composition of seared scallops resting on a delicate sauce that shimmered beneath the candlelight. The aroma alone caused several nearby diners to glance over with curiosity. Daniel Laurent remained beside the table for a moment. "The first course," he said with a respectful smile. Marcus looked down at the plate with quiet appreciation. "It looks beautiful." The chef inclined his head slightly before returning toward the kitchen. As he passed the host stand, he slowed for just a second. Ethan looked up quickly, unsure whether to speak. Daniel Laurent paused beside him and lowered his voice. "A restaurant is not only a place for food," the chef said calmly. "It is a place where people should feel welcome." Ethan swallowed and nodded, unable to meet the chef's eyes. The words were not harsh, yet they carried a lesson far stronger than anger. Daniel Laurent continued toward the kitchen, while the young waiter remained frozen behind the stand, absorbing the meaning of what had just happened. At the window table, Marcus Reed lifted the fork slowly and tasted the first bite. The quiet expression on his face softened into a small smile as he looked toward the kitchen doors again. The room gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but something deeper had changed beneath the surface. What had begun as a moment of quiet rejection had transformed into a lesson that everyone in Sterling Table could feel, even if no one spoke it aloud. The evening at Sterling Table continued with a rhythm that felt both familiar and subtly transformed. The soft music from the piano drifted through the dining room, while servers moved gracefully between tables carrying plates that shimmered beneath the warm chandelier light. Yet every member of the staff was aware that something meaningful had happened near the entrance earlier. Moments like that did not simply disappear. They settled quietly into the atmosphere of a place, shaping how people moved and spoke for the rest of the night. At the window table, Marcus Reed continued, tasting the meal Daniel Laurent had prepared. The scallops had been perfectly seared, their delicate sweetness balanced by a light citrus sauce that carried the faint aroma of fresh herbs. Marcus ate slowly, not because he was judging the dish, but because he respected the effort that had gone into creating it. Every few minutes, he glanced toward the kitchen doors where the steady motion of cooks and servers continued like a carefully choreographed dance. In the kitchen, Daniel Laurent stood at the pass, watching the plates move out toward the dining room. The memory of the earlier moment still lingered in his mind. He had spent years building this restaurant into one of the most respected dining rooms in Chicago. Yet the values that shaped the place had begun long before Sterling Table ever opened its doors. Those values had started in a much smaller kitchen where a young cook learned that talent meant nothing if dignity was ignored. Daniel Laurent picked up the next plate of the tasting and inspected it carefully before allowing the server to carry it out. When the door swung open, he caught a glimpse of Marcus Reed sitting beside the window, calm and thoughtful as always. The chef allowed himself a small smile before turning back to his work. Near the entrance, Ethan Collins remained behind the host stand, but he was no longer standing with folded arms. Instead, he watched the dining room with a quiet seriousness that had not been there earlier in the evening. The lesson Daniel Laurent had spoken a short time ago continued echoing in his mind. A restaurant is not only a place for food. It is a place where people should feel welcome. Ethan replayed the entire encounter again and again in his thoughts. The calm patience Marcus Reed had shown, the respect Daniel Laurent had offered, the way the entire room had changed when the truth became clear. For the first time since beginning his job at Sterling Table, Ethan understood that hospitality was not simply about following a reservation list or protecting an image. It was about recognizing the humanity of every person who walked through the door. After several minutes, Ethan made a quiet decision. He stepped away from the host stand and walked slowly across the dining room toward the window table. His footsteps felt heavier than usual, not because of fear, but because he knew that humility required courage. Marcus Reed noticed him approaching and set down his fork before the waiter reached the table. Ethan stopped beside the chair and took a slow breath. "Mr. Reed," he said carefully, "I would like to apologize." The words came out sincerely, without the forced politeness he had used earlier. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. That was wrong." Marcus listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm but attentive. When Ethan finished speaking, the older man nodded gently. "Everyone makes mistakes," Marcus replied. "What matters is whether we learn from them." The simple answer carried more grace than Ethan expected. The tension that had weighed on his chest since the beginning of the evening slowly began to lift. "Thank you for giving me the chance to say that," the waiter said quietly. Marcus gave a small smile and returned his attention to the meal in front of him. Ethan walked back toward the host stand, feeling as though he had stepped into a different version of the same room. The chandeliers still glowed. The piano still played softly. The restaurant looked exactly the same. Yet the way he saw it had changed completely. And across the room, the quiet figure beside the window continued enjoying his dinner, unaware that his calm dignity had just taught one more person what true hospitality meant. The evening continued unfolding at Sterling Table with the steady elegance that had made the restaurant famous across Chicago. Candlelight shimmered gently across the white linen tables, while the piano played a soft melody that drifted through the room like warm air on a quiet night. Guests spoke in relaxed voices again, forks and glasses moving in an easy rhythm that suggested the earlier tension had faded into memory. Yet for several people in the room, the meaning of what had happened near the entrance had not disappeared at all. It had simply settled into something deeper. At the window table, Marcus Reed continued, enjoying the meal Daniel Laurent had prepared. The tasting menu arrived course by course, each plate more thoughtful than the last. A delicate soup infused with roasted garlic. A perfectly balanced dish of wild mushrooms and fresh herbs. Then a carefully seared cut of beef resting beside a slow-cooked vegetable puree that carried the warm scent of rosemary. Marcus tasted each dish slowly, not with the hurried appetite of someone trying to finish dinner, but with the quiet appreciation of a man who respected craftsmanship in any form. Each bite reminded him that Daniel Laurent had grown far beyond the young cook he once met in that small kitchen years ago. Across the room, the chef stepped out of the kitchen once more, carrying the final plate of the evening himself. The dessert was simple yet elegant. A warm chocolate cake resting beside a small scoop of vanilla bean cream and a drizzle of caramel that glowed beneath the candlelight. Daniel Laurent placed the plate gently in front of Marcus Reed and allowed a small smile to cross his face. "The last course," he said. Marcus looked down at the dessert and then back at the chef. "You have built something remarkable here." Daniel shook his head slightly. "I built it because someone once believed I could." The words were quiet but sincere. For a moment, both men stood there in comfortable silence while the music from the piano floated softly through the room. Nearby diners watched the exchange with growing curiosity, sensing that the guest beside the window carried a story deeper than the elegant meal placed before him. After a moment, Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a small folded card. He placed it carefully on the table between them. Daniel Laurent glanced down at it and then back up with a puzzled expression. "What is this?" he asked. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. "An invitation," he said calmly. The chef opened the card slowly. Inside was the simple printed heading of a national culinary foundation that supported young chefs across the United States. Beneath the heading was a short note written in careful handwriting. Daniel Laurent read the words once and then again as realization slowly dawned across his face. Marcus watched the reaction quietly. Every year, that foundation searches for kitchens willing to mentor talented young cooks who cannot afford the training on their own, Marcus explained. "I thought Sterling Table might be the right place." Daniel Laurent looked up from the card, his expression filled with quiet gratitude. "You are giving someone else the same chance you once gave me," he said softly. Marcus nodded once. Opportunity should never stop with one person. Across the room, Ethan Collins watched the moment from the host stand. He could not hear the conversation, but he saw the expression on the chef's face and understood that something important had just been offered. The realization settled deeply in his mind. Earlier that evening, he had tried to turn Marcus Reed away from the door. Now he was watching the same man create an opportunity that could change the life of another young cook somewhere in the future. Daniel Laurent closed the card carefully and placed it against his chest for a brief second. "I would be honored to help," he said. Marcus smiled gently and returned his attention to the dessert in front of him while the quiet rhythm of Sterling Table carried on around them, the restaurant glowing with the kind of warmth that only true hospitality could create. The warm light inside Sterling Table slowly softened as the evening moved toward its final hour. Outside the tall windows, the city of Chicago shimmered with distant headlights and the quiet glow of office towers stretching toward the dark sky above Lake Michigan. Inside the restaurant, the last notes from the piano drifted gently across the room while guests finished their meals and spoke in relaxed voices. At the window, table Marcus Reed finished the final bite of dessert and placed his fork carefully beside the plate. Across from him, Daniel Laurent still stood with the invitation card resting in his hand. For a moment, neither man spoke. The quiet felt complete in a way that only happens when something meaningful has just taken place. Finally, Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair and looked around the dining room with calm satisfaction. "You built this place with dignity," he said softly. Daniel Laurent followed his gaze across the glowing tables and the staff, moving with practiced grace between the guests. "I try to build it the way someone once treated me," the chef replied. Marcus nodded once. "Then you succeeded." The chef placed the invitation card safely inside the pocket of his jacket and pulled the chair across from Marcus just slightly closer, though he remained standing beside it. His voice carried the same quiet respect he had shown earlier. "Many young cooks will be grateful for that opportunity," Daniel said. Marcus smiled gently. "They will earn it through their own work, just as you did." Around them, the restaurant staff continued their evening routine, yet the people who had witnessed the events near the entrance earlier still felt the meaning of it. Luis moved carefully between tables collecting empty glasses, pausing for a moment as he passed the window table to offer Marcus a respectful nod. At the entrance, Ethan Collins watched the dining room from the host stand with a completely different posture than he had shown hours earlier. The young waiter now greeted each new guest with a patience and warmth that had not been there before. The lesson of the evening had settled deeply in his mind. After a few more minutes, Marcus stood from the table and reached for his coat. Daniel Laurent immediately stepped forward. "Please allow me to walk you out," the chef said. Marcus accepted with a quiet nod. Together, they crossed the dining room while several guests looked up with polite curiosity. When they reached the entrance, Ethan Collins straightened quickly. This time his voice carried sincere respect. "Thank you for visiting Sterling Table tonight, Mr. Reed." Marcus paused and looked at him calmly. "Take care of the people who walk through that door," he said gently. "You never know which life might change yours." Ethan nodded, understanding the meaning behind the words. Daniel Laurent opened the door, and the cool night air from the Chicago street flowed softly into the restaurant. Marcus stepped outside beneath the glow of the streetlights and looked once more at the elegant building behind him. Daniel remained in the doorway. "I will make sure the foundation hears from us soon," the chef said. Marcus gave a final small smile. "I look forward to seeing what you teach the next generation." With that, he walked slowly down the sidewalk, disappearing into the quiet movement of the city. Daniel Laurent watched him for a moment before returning inside. The door closed softly behind him, and the warm glow of Sterling Table filled the room once again. And though the restaurant looked exactly the same as it had earlier that evening, every person inside understood something new. Kindness was not weakness. It was the quiet strength that could open doors long after the world believed they were closed.